It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. On February 17th, 4 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Barack Obama and Bill Clinton penned an open letter to the Bernie Sanders campaign and economist Gerald Friedman. In it, they claimed that presidential candidate Bernie Sanders' economic plan and much of the optimism behind it could not be supported by economic evidence. The letter was a response to the economist Gerald Friedman's predictions that Sanders' campaign plan would yield strong economic rates as well as higher employment levels. With us to discuss this issue is James K. Galbraith. He's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, LBJ School of Public Affairs, and author of INEQUALITY, What Everyone Needs to Know, just out from Oxford University Press. James, thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
James, the Council of Economic Advisors, they put out economic forecasts each year, and there has been some wildly optimistic ones. For example, if you look at the 2010 predictions for 2012 and 2013, they have not quite been attained, and one would say it was done in the interest of trying to make the administration that they were serving more impressive. But what accounts for this particular attack on Friedman's projection, another fellow economist?
This was a classic case of professional bad manners and rank pulling. What we had here were 4 former chairs of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and 2 from President Obama, 2 from President Clinton, who decided to use their big names and their titles in order to launch an attack on a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts who had written a paper evaluating the Sanders economic program. It's likely that the 4 bigwigs thought that Professor Friedman was a Bernie Sanders supporter. And in fact, as of that time, he was a Hillary Clinton supporter and a modest donor to her campaign. And what he had done was simply to write his evaluation of the economic effects of the ambitious Sanders reform program. The 4 former council chairs announced that on the basis of their deep commitment to rigor and objectivity, they had discovered that this forecast was unrealistic. And what I pointed out was that that claim was based on no evidence and no analysis whatsoever. And when you pressed down on it, you found that it was simply based on the obvious fact that we haven't seen the kinds of growth rates that Professor Friedman's analysis suggested the Sanders program would produce. And for a very simple reason, the Sanders program is bigger. It's more ambitious than anything we've seen in recent years. So it's not surprising that when you put it through a model, it generates a higher growth rate. So that was the basic underlying facts. And these guys, two men and 2 women, announced that that it was a disreputable study, but failed to present any analysis that suggested they'd actually even read the paper before they denounced it. And that's what I pointed out in my counter letter in a number of articles that have appeared since.
James, so in your letter, how do you counter them? What methods did you use to come to your conclusions?
Well, I had no need to say anything beyond the fact that I had looked in their letter for the rigor that they were so proud of, for the objectivity and the analysis that they were so proud of, and I found that they had not done any. They had not made any such claim, not made any such, done any such work. So that began to provoke a discussion. It's fair to say, ultimately, without apologizing for effectively launching an ad hominem attack on an independent academic researcher, one of the former chairs, Christina Romer of President Obama's council, and her husband, David Romer, a fellow economist, did produce a paper in which they spelled out their differences with the Friedman paper. But that again raised another set of interesting issues, which we've continued to discuss in various outlets in the press.
Now, James Friedman's claim that the growth rate from Sanders' plan to be around 5.3%. And some economists, including Dean Baker at the Center for Economic Policy and Research, have claimed that this is unrealistic. What do you make of that?
Well, the question is whether it is an effect, let's say, a reasonable projection of putting the Sanders program into an economic model. And the answer to that question, yes, Professor Friedman did a reasonable job. He spelled out what the underlying assumptions that he was using were. He spelled out the basic rules of thumb that macroeconomists have used for decades to assess the effects of an economic program, in this case, an expansionary economic program. And he ran them through his model and it reported the results. Perfectly reasonable thing to do. Now, one can be skeptical, and I am, and Dean Baker is. Lots of people are skeptical that the world would work out quite that way, because lots of things, in fact, happen which are not accounted for in a model. And you can basically put together a list of things that you think might be problematic. But the exercise here was not to put everything into paper that might happen in the world. The exercise was to take a kind of bare bones that economists use to assess and to compare the consequences of alternative programs and to ask, what kind of results do you get out? And that's what Jerry Friedman did. It was a reasonable exercise. He came up with a reasonable answer and he reported it.
Now, Friedman seems to think that the rate of full employment in 1999 is attainable. However, many labor economists seem to think that the larger share of the elderly currently in society compared to 1999 explains some of the lack of labor participation, which creates a lower full employment ceiling. That's contradicting Friedman's report. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it is a fact that the population is getting older. But as I think any economist would tell you, that when you offer jobs in the labor market, the first thing that happens is that people who are looking for work take those jobs. The second thing that happens is that people who might look for work, if jobs were available, start coming back into the labor market. And if that is not enough to fill the vacancies that you have, it's perfectly open to employers to raise their wages so as to bring more people in, or to increase the pace at which they innovate and substitute technology for labor so that they don't need the work. So there's no real crisis involved in a situation. If it turns out 5 years from now we're at 3.5% unemployment, and we're beginning to run short of labor. That's not a reason to, at this stage, say, no, we're not going to engage in the exercise and run a more expansionary, a vigorous reform program, a vigorous infrastructure project, a major reform of the healthcare, a tuition-free public education program. All of those things, which were part of what Friedman put into his paper, should be done anyway. And the fact that the labor market forecast might prove to have some, different, the labor market might have different characteristics in 5 years' time, is, from our present point of view, just it's an academic or a theoretical proposition, purely.
And Friedman's paper, he looks at a 10-year forecast. Did you feel that when you looked at the specifics of that, including college, universal health care, infrastructure spending, and of course expanding Social Security and so on, that those categories and his predictions, or projections rather, made sense to you?
Well, again, what he was doing was running a program of a certain scale, of a large scale, through a set of standard macroeconomic assumptions. And that, again, is a reasonable exercise. If you ask me what my personal view is, I've written a whole book called The End of Normal, in which I lay out reasons for my chronic pessimism about the capacity of the world economy to absorb a great deal more rapid economic growth. But that's not in the standard models, and it would not be appropriate to layer that on to a forecast of this kind. What Friedman was criticized for was not for putting his thumb on the scale, but for failing to put his thumb on the scale. And in fact, that was the reasonable thing to do. On the contrary, and on the other side, when Christina and David Romer did put out their forecast, they their own criticism of the Friedman paper. They concluded by asserting that if this program were tried, inflation would soar. So they there were making an allegation for which, again, they had no evidence and no plausible model that in the world in which we presently live would produce that result. So what we had here was what was essentially an academic exercise that produced a result that was highly favorable to the Sanders position, that showed that if you did an ambitious program, you would get a strong growth response. It's reasonable, certainly for the first 3 or 4 years, that would transpire in practice. And what happened was that people who didn't like that result politically jumped on it in a way which was, frankly speaking, professionally irresponsible, in my view. It was designed to convey the impression, which it succeeded in doing for a brief while through the broad media, that this was not a reputable exercise and that there were responsible people on one side of the debate and irresponsible people on the other. And that was, again, something that an impression that could be conveyed through the mass media, but would not withstand scrutiny, and didn't withstand scrutiny once a few of us stood up and started saying, okay, where's your evidence? On what are you basing this argument? And revealed the point which the Romers implicitly conceded, and I give them credit for that, that in order to criticize a fellow economist, you need to do some work.
James, thank you so much for joining us. And this election year, we hope to have you back very soon.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.